Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, zerilli-marimò, for this very special evening dedicated to Leonardo that is entitled We Are Leonardo. And it's the only event that we dedicated to the 500th anniversary from Leonardo's death that we are celebrating right now. But I think it's an event that incorporates several aspects that are remarkable. And the first one is that we are bringing together tonight a very important art historian, the chair of the Department of Art History here at New York University, and the contemporary artist from Italy, who on top of being a very creative and very, how do you say, esplosiva artist, explosive. Every time she comes to my office, she has new ideas, and she has come up with new paths, who is also a very serious scholar in her own right. Normally, her works are based on a lot of research that she does to reach the point of expression that she will show us. So I'm very proud of having put together and combined the knowledge of an art historian and the creativity of an artist to celebrate Leonardo. The evening is packed, and I want to leave the podium to them that have many interesting things to tell us. And so, as I mentioned, Professor Dennis Geronimus is the chair of the Department of Art History here at New York University. He's an authority in the field of Italian Renaissance studies. He wrote the fundamental book about Piero di Cosimo, and he has a book forthcoming on Pontormo, I believe, with Yale University Press. And he has also written about Leonardo, and especially on The Last Supper, beautiful book also made in cooperation with the photographer. So I couldn't think of a better person to be here with us tonight. And the title of his talk is, in Leonardo's own words and images, a portrait of an artist as a young man. Please welcome Professor Dennis Geronimus.
All right. And is it possible to dim the lights a little bit? Thank you. See some of my former students in the audience. So I must begin by thanking, of course, Stefano and his wonderful staff for inviting me and for making this collaboration with Vittoria possible. And needless to say, my deepest thanks I must extend to Vittoria. We've known each other for 8 years, I think. Our first collaboration was, in fact, when she made a reinterpretation, revisualized another work by Leonardo that's now gifted to the Center for the Humanities here at NYU, The Battle of Anghiari. And we've been friends ever since. So this is a true pleasure. I actually started out as an artist before chickening out and becoming an art historian. And I would like to think maybe that's why Vittoria and I get along so well. Because I'm not just one of these art historians who takes everything so literally and so seriously. But we'll see. So I wanted to begin by saying that what I have to offer tonight is something of as best as I could cook up in a few days, a personal and personalized history, a more human, I think, look at Leonardo, something of a intellectual portrait, one that's born of his lived experience growing up in rural Tuscany, then coming to Florence as a teen, and also, as I think all of you would agree, one can very easily judge themselves and one's friends by the books that they read. So the second part of the presentation will be about what he read as well as what he wrote, and I will conclude by showing a few portraits of Leonardo, not self-portraits, but portraits, and I think hopefully that will serve as something of a nice contextual introduction for Vittoria's fascinating latest project. So to begin at the beginning, so in the 40 minutes or so I have, I will go through a whole host of images, and I'll say a few things about some, and leave others to your imagination. But again, with the goal of dispelling some of these lingering myths, I think, that are familiar to many, if not all of you, about Leonardo as a almost preternatural sorcerer-like or wizard-like figure that who is completely inaccessible and inscrutable to human knowledge. I hope he will become at least a little more disarmingly real. And what more real way to ground an artist than to look at the house in which he was born. And that is what one sees here on the right. I will read to you the earliest, I will begin by reading to you the earliest mention of Leonardo in the history of Leonardo's studies. And it comes from the pen of his grandfather, Antonio Da Vinci, from whom we learn actually a great deal about the early life of Leonardo. And he writes, 1452, my grandson was born, son of Ser Piero, my son, on the day of April 15th, a Saturday, at the hour of 3 in the night. He was named Leonardo, spelled with an I, by the way, not an E. And this is his first ever mention. The birth, in fact, wouldn't have occurred at 3 a.m. our time. This is Renaissance time, because the end of the day was marked by sundown, right? So this is what art historian nerds do. We determine the times of day going back all the way to 1452, and in our time it would be closer to 10:30 p.m. that he was born. And he wasn't born in Vinci, so his full name was Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, so Leonardo, the son of Piero, from the little town of Vinci, right? This is why when all of you leave this room, you will never, ever, anywhere, to anyone, at any time, call him Da Vinci, right? Because that means from Vinci. So you have to call him Leonardo. But he was actually not technically born in Vinci. He was born in a still smaller place, a hamlet called Anciano, very close to Vinci. And the scene that you see here from above is of Vinci itself, which, as you can see, is a very typical Tuscan hilltop town that's located about 20 miles west of Florence. And zooming in a bit closer, what we see here on the right is now the Leonardo Museum in Vinci that all of you, I hope, will someday visit. That used to be the Castello dei Conte Guidi, the castle of the Guidi, the Counts Guidi from the 11th to 12th century. So he really has pride of place now in his hometown. He was born out of wedlock to a woman named Caterina. She was a farmer's daughter. And Ser Piero da Vinci, or Ser Pier Vinci, who was a quite highly sought after notary, which was a profession really situated in the upper echelons of Italian society at this time. Marcel Duchamp's father, I believe, was also a notary. And about 10 years after Leonardo's birth, so it would have been about 1462, Ser Piero was employed in Florence as a notary for none other than Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo il Vecchio, the de facto ruler of Florence at the time, who was to die just 2 years later. So Ser Piero already made his mark when Leonardo was still a boy and visiting the city of Florence for the first time. Ser Pier da Vinci also drew up a number of deeds for someone whose surname may be rather familiar to all of you. Someone named Ser Francesco del Giocondo, a wealthy Florentine merchant and the husband of a certain Lisa Gerardini, who is, of course, the Mona Lisa. Her husband was Lisa's senior by about 14 years. And Ser Piero was also Ser Francesco del Giocondo's brother's notary. So he moved in quite important circles. But at a very young age, probably by the age of 4, Leonardo was taken from Caterina and placed in the care of his father's actual wife, named Albiera. And so Florentines, as some of you already know, whose illegitimate paternity was admitted, were overwhelmingly born to men of the so-called elite, but to poor or usually servant mothers. And this was the case with the young Leonardo. Leonardo was to have no fewer than 4 stepmothers, or martigne, Albiera, Francesca, Margarita, and a woman named Lucrezia, who died after Leonardo passed. She died after 1520. And as for his birth mother, Caterina, records show that Leonardo often visited her whenever he was in Vinci. She lived outside of Vinci in a little rural town called Campo Zeppi, that you can still visit today, where she lived with her husband. He was a bondsman with a fantastic name. His name was Antonio di Piero Butti del Vacca. He was also known as Accattabriga, or basically trouble seeker, someone who literally begs for a quarrel, a tough guy, someone who picked fights, a mischief maker. And she married him just a year or so, probably within a year of Leonardo's birth. It seems that the marriage was set up by Leonardo's father. He married off Caterina after she illegitimately gave birth to Leonardo. And upon the death of Caterina's husband, she later came to live with Leonardo when he was in Milan. She was at the age of 60 at that point, and it's known that Leonardo paid for her burial. So he was very close to his birth mother until the time of her death. And the reason why I'm spending so much time on his earliest minutes, really, or years, is that I think most, or if not all, art historians would readily agree that his time in Vinci, even though sometimes we stampede straight to Florence, were among his most formative ties. We don't have all that many drawings from this period, from his, let's say, early or even mid-teens. But this is potentially the earliest drawing that we do have by Leonardo's hand. And it's a very celebrated one. It's a study of a Tuscan landscape. And art historians have been working out, we're usually a sedentary bunch, but I'm sure hundreds of Renaissance scholars have donned their Solomon boots and have gone trekking out to Tuscany to actually search for this site. And no one has yet determined whether this is an actual place, because it kind of looks like Monte Vetolini, which is fairly close to Vinci. It's been suggested that it's maybe the area around Valdegna Novole, near Pistoia, north of Florence. Some have suggested it's near the hills of Monsumano, especially the hill on the right, and the marshlands of Fucecchio that might be seen in the background. But it may very well be a composite or partially observed, partially imagined landscape. What we do have is an inscription at the upper left that, as you can see, reads in his now typical backward script, Feast of St. Mary of the Snow, the day of August 5th, 1473. So he would have been 21 years old. This is the earliest documented drawing. And I hope all of you love seeing the backs of things as much as I do, because the verso of this drawing isn't all that typically illustrated, but you see that here a much more freehand, rapid sketch of a landscape, which would make me think that it's observed in plein air, but that's also subject to debate. But the one thing that he certainly would have seen, other than these vast panoramas and aerial vistas complete with waterfalls and mountain ranges and castelli here, these townships, would have also been nature in microcosm. And I have to admit, other than Vittoria's work, which I absolutely love, I absolutely adore the sketch on the right. It's potentially one of my 100 favorite Leonardo drawings. And this fellow lives here in New York at the Met, in the Lehman collection. It's a walking bear sketched, certainly from the life, in metal point on this light buff paper, probably dating from the very early 1480s, 1482 to 85. And he's, speaking of microcosm, he's even sketching creatures as small as beetles and dragonflies in this sketch that, it's a sketch that has been cut out by some unscrupulous collector and pasted onto another sheet. These now dwell in Turin. But of course, not satisfied with seeing a bear walking or roaming around the Tuscan countryside or maybe in a menagerie. He then studied or-sign locomotion. So he's actually studying, as you can see here, how bears move. And if you look very closely, this is something of a recycled sheet, because if you were to turn this 90 degrees, you have a Madonna child sketched in metal point, very, very faintly, a ghost image of the Virgin beneath this walking, striding bear. But again, unsatisfied with only studying the outside of the bear, he then dissects one of the legs of the bear to figure out how this incredible furry machine works, how bears move. And then this charming sketch in a private collection of the head of a bear, also probably from the mid-1480s. So these are the kinds of creatures, big and small, that he would have seen, if not in Ancano or Vinci, but somewhere nearby in the countryside, or maybe again in a menagerie once he got to Florence. And I want to also, now moving to the human figure, move on kind of to the middle part of what I wanted to discuss, which is the importance of writing, of not just observing from nature, whether it's the human body in motion under stress, both the exterior of the body and our internal organs, or those of animals, but everything from hydraulics to ballistics, right, to engineering and beyond. And we often term the collection of Leonardo's writings, and I should say that he really, I think, began to consider himself as a writer, as an autore, probably when he arrived in Milan, which is where Vittoria will pick up with her presentation once he arrives in the court of Ludovico Sforza. So it's about in 1482, when he's already 30 years old, which is already a very advanced, mature age for a Renaissance master. And usually his compendium of writings is called a trattato, or a treatise of painting, Trattato della Pittura. And it's something of a misnomer. First of all, it wasn't published until 1651, and that is what you see here on the left. This is an edition from the Getty. This is the very first edition that was published by a Parisian publisher named Jacques Langlois, and these illustrations were designed by none other than Poussin. But for all of us, not just Italian, but English speakers, it wasn't until 1721 that the first English edition of this text came to be. There have been 18 translations and counting of the Trattato. But what we're dealing with is basically a scattered kind of explosion of notes and memoranda that Leonardo left at his death in May 1519, 500 years ago, that were lovingly, meticulously organized into something resembling a treatise by his most faithful disciple in Milan named Francesco Melzi. And it was Melzi who was in fact present at his deathbed, along with two priests from the Church of Saint-Denis in Amboise and two Franciscan priests. And it was to Melzi that the responsibility of serving as the executor of Leonardo's will fell in 1519. So he was his closest, both student as well as assistant. And it's really to Melzi that, not to, of course, ignore Leonardo's contribution, since he did all the work in writing down all these observations in the hope of presumably someday publishing them. But it was Melzi who gathered all of these chestfuls, I'm sure, of notes into something that we now call a treatise. And just to give you some sense of what we're dealing with here, about 6,000 pages of Leonardo's written and drawn legacy have come down to us, and that is probably, I'm guessing, about a fifth of what he had originally produced, meaning there were probably about 30,000 of these sheets. So this was an incredible editorial feat, and this manuscript is now called the Codex Urbinus Vaticanus, 1270 in the Vatican. And what you see here is the very first edition, and what I'm showing you here on the right, this is a passage on human movement, and here I'm showing you a fairly early preparatory sketch for a work that was either completed or hasn't survived, of a Saint Sebastian and Penitence. I'm sure many of you have seen the unfinished Saint Sebastian from the Vatican Museums at the Met that's there until October 6th. This one is on prepared blue paper that is absolutely remarkable in its dynamism. This is in the Royal Collection in Windsor. So again, we have probably over 6,000 of these sheets, both of writing and sketches or sketches. Many of the sheets used over many years, to which Leonardo, like Michelangelo, would return and use both front and back. And now the question for us becomes, well, that's pretty overwhelming, studying all of Leonardo's torrents of thoughts and observations of ideas in writing. Well, what other than nature herself inspired Leonardo to go on these intellectual quests? And one answer certainly is what he read. And there's been a whole kind of efflorescence of interest on the part of literary scholars and art historians on his collection of books. And we now know more than we ever have, and they're all cataloged and published. And there was just an exhibition this summer at the Museo Galileo called Leonardo and His Books. Unfortunately, many of the books were exhibited in facsimile, including the only one in the exhibition that we know Leonardo in fact owned, because as we'll see in a few minutes, his handwriting appears in the upper right corner. But it was still an absolutely eye-opening exhibition that told us a great deal about not just what he read, but just how astonishing his range of reading was. And what you see here is a copy of Pliny the Elder, his Historia Naturalia from the 1st century, which he owned, and also something that virtually every artist would have owned and probably memorized, Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is the story of Salmacis and Hermaphroditus from this book of constant flux and changes and transformations that in this fascination of this never-ending cycle of metamorphosis must have absolutely fascinated a mind like Leonardo's. As would have, by the way, Dante's, of course, Divina Commedia, which he owned as well, and which, as we know, from Botticelli on to Michelangelo, artist's mind for, if nothing else, it's evocative visual descriptions. It's something that Leonardo cared a great deal about in formulating his own and articulating his own paragone, kind of competitive trial, right, between the various arts, including poetry and the visual arts. And these are photographs that I took this summer from the Museo Galileo exhibition to bring back to you. It was very much a multimedia exhibition, and here you see two publications by Ptolemy. And just to give you a sense of numbers, the volume of these volumes. As recorded in Milan in 1495, Leonardo owned about 40 titles. And most of these were literary texts and books on language, aspects of language. By the end of 1503, so 8 years later, when he returned to Florence for his final stay, the number of his volumes counted 116. And it really was a collection that would have constituted a research library. When he was first collecting books, most of the volumes were in the vernacular, meaning in Italian. As I mentioned, they were mostly literary works. They were virtually all printed rather than in manuscript form. But by 1503, these books were, the collection was so enormous, it was locked in chests in the church of Santa Maria Novella, where he was working on the Battle of Anghiari. So he had his own research library in Florence with him. And the books now were on philosophy, geometry, science, cosmography, I should say, astronomy, medicine, and more volumes now appeared in Latin. And this was a big sticking point, a sore subject for Leonardo, who oftentimes has been presented as a very inscrutable figure. You know, we just don't know what he was like. But if one, and it's largely true, but if one reads his notes, especially the notes that almost certainly were not meant to be read by anyone, he was very cantankerous and quite cynical when it came to his vision of humankind For example, he mentioned humankind as sacks of food and excrement. That doesn't sound very complimentary. And he certainly didn't have very kind things to say about humankind's desires, avarice, greed, materialism. And we're going to show how that manifested itself in some of his drawings in a second. But one of the things that he was very sensitive about was his lack of knowledge of Latin. And he did have a Latin primer, so he did try to teach himself Latin, but most of his books were in the vernacular. But of course he had a Bible, as well as Dante's Divine Comedy. He had epic poetry by Luigi and Luca Pucci, collections of short stories by Poggio Bracciolini and Masuccio Salernitano. He also had collections of texts on military inventions. The most famous one you can see here, which was a collection that was illustrated with about 82 woodcuts. And this is Roberto Valturio's De Re Militario, or The Art of War. And you see these rather horrible machines of war here being pulled by oxen and horses. This is perhaps the best known one by Valturio that shows this kind of expandable tower and dragon-shaped war machine. And perhaps they inspired, when Leonardo finally did make it to the court of Ludovico Sforza in Milan, these kinds of inventions, these machines of war that are absolutely horrific, chopping up bodies with these scythe-like rotating devices. These are from the very first years of his stay in Milan, from about 1482 to 85. And again, it I think brings home this impression that Leonardo was not only interested in so many different areas of study and investigation, but that his character was one that was always marked by seeming contradiction, or certainly multiplicity, in that the same man who produced these horrific machines of death that we just saw, of course, produced these heart-achingly beautiful natural botanical studies of these seed heads of both of these are in Windsor, of rushes. He didn't actually know the scientific names of them. He called them the third type of rush and the fourth type of rush. And they're bending down their heads as if they're kernels of corn, and a branch of blackberry on the right. These are from about 1510 and 1505 to 1510. So the only text that was in the Museo Galileo exhibition that bears his actual hand and that we know he owned is this one by someone who became his friend, a Sienese engineer named Francesco Di Giorgio. And you might know that name. It might ring a bell because he was responsible for designing and supervising the creation of this remarkable, almost kind of virtual reality space that now inhabits the Metropolitan Museum of Art, originally from the Ducal Palace in Gubbio, made of many varieties of different fruit woods from the late 1470s to 1480s. And so the final, ecco, the final section that I just wanted to introduce to you is, of course, now that we know, again, in half an hour or so, how much can I tell you about Leonardo? But hopefully I've offered just a small glimpse of where he came from, where he sprung from, and what he wrote and what he read. But now that we have that at least broad intellectual portrait, what was his actual appearance like? What did he look like? Which is one of the many objectives, I think, or inspirations behind Vittoria's project. And here I'm going to show you just a few images and some imagined correspondences to Leonardo's likeness, and others perhaps more credible. And one that is, I would say, maybe less credible is this one. And this is a work by Leonardo's teacher, who I'm sure is familiar to some of you, Andrea del Verrocchio, who was just the subject of a brilliant show in the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, and he's about to alight in Washington very soon. I promised my students that we're going to try to get some cheap bus tickets from Chinatown. maybe with the art history department pitching in to see it, and Andrew Butterfield and Gretchen Hirschauer will lead us around. But this is the post-restoration bronze David, who only measures about 4 feet in height, but his size belies the power and the tension of this remarkable work. We know it was certainly finished by 1476, because this is the year in which the Signoria purchased this figure from the Palazzo Medici, from the Medici family. But it was probably either begun or finished in the mid to late 1460s. Anyway, even if it was 1476, Leonardo still would have only been about 24. And you probably see where I'm going with this. Some art historians, especially in the last century, early in the last century, wanted to see this as kind of a subsumed portrait or likeness of Leonardo. And it is, I should say it is true that when Verrocchio makes his more kind of almost angelic young male types, they have broader faces than this. But I would also claim that many of his figures have something of a similar physiognomy to this. So it's a very general, I would say, parallel, although a tempting one. And certainly, if not in letter, then in spirit, because what we see here is, of course, a detail of the profile. And this is a very early drawing from the 1470s, mid to late 1470s, now in Windsor, in which you see these Epicene youths that E.H. Gombrich often contrasted with kind of old jowly men that he called nutcracker heads, because if there was anything that Leonardo was obsessed with, it was opposites. It wasn't just patterns and parallels, but it was also opposites. And so this kind of Grecian idealized youth, even if not a portrait of Leonardo, was certainly an ideal young male model that Leonardo, in his youth, adopted in his own works. So what did he look like? The remarkable thing is that out of all the descriptions that have come down to us, at least contemporary ones, none of them describe Leonardo as bearded. And yet, if you were to close your eyes and try to imagine him, he almost always has this almost kind of Aristotelian look, right? I think I mentioned sorcerer or wizard before. And this is an anonymous painting from the late 17th century that's now in the Uffizi. And this really has come down to us as something of kind of the typical Leonardo type. And I don't want to go on for too long, but just a word about beards, if I may. How many of you are bearded here? Yeah, I tried once and I made it about 5 days. It was incredibly uncomfortable. But beards would have been seen as very odd on an Italian male in the 16th century. And I warned you that art historians have, dug widely and deeply on every little detail, trying to find clues, both in terms of social history and art history in this period. And this also extends to beards. Douglas Biao from University of Texas at Austin has actually written a great deal about this. But they would have been very odd in the preceding century. They would have been associated with the other. Both with Northerners, meaning with Germans, who were thought to be hirsute, too hairy. They were also associated with Jews and with Muslims. And things began to change, at least according to some historians and social historians, after the discovery of the so-called New World. Because then the contrast became with the so-called natives or barbarians, right, of the New World, who were all clean-faced, or as they would have been called, clean-shaven. And so beards became more popular. And one of the arguments that Douglas Biao makes is that, especially after so many wars, both regional and what he calls the Italian Wars, more widespread, there was so much anxiety about the loss of independence, civic independence, that this actually trickled down to the behavior and the sense of identity of men in this period. And so these distinctive beards became almost an act of self-performance, of both hiding your anxieties and also staking out a sense of difference. And you know, one could give a whole entire course on beards, as I realized earlier today as I was putting this together. My favorite one is the swallow beard that is sported by Bartolomeo Panciatichi, whose wife obviously thought he was very handsome, I guess, in wearing it. And Stefano was kind enough to mention my book in progress on Pontormo. This is one of his later portraits from the early 1540s of a Monsignor that's now in the National Gallery in Washington. So there was a whole fashion for beards. And again, when we think of Leonardo as magus, right? This is the representation that has come down to us and is most readily, I think, associated with Leonardo, certainly when he was in the court, either of the Duke of Milan or in, you know, inventing again these cannons and machines of war, casting the Sforza Equestrian Monument. But to me, coming probably closer to Don Quixote in his study than perhaps historical truth. And historical truth has proved very elusive, even with drawings that we think we knew. How many of you are familiar with the Turin sketch on the right? Probably most of you. And for generations, it was considered to be not just a portrait, it's certainly by Leonardo's hand, but a self-portrait. And now judgment is nearly, I think, unanimous, certainly weighs heavier on the side of a much earlier dating, possibly around 1495. So Leonardo would have been far too young to represent himself like this. It is probably a drawing for one of the apostles, possibly for one of the apostles in the Last Supper in Milan, or just a study of an old man, which certainly doesn't seem as evocative, right, in interpretation. But it was at least evocative enough for Yasamura Marimura, who's a Japanese artist and a chameleon of sorts who appropriates everything from Jan van Eyck's man in a red turban to Marilyn Monroe, and here appears as what he conceives to be Leonardo. And then there's this Leonardo, which in fact might come closer to the truth, the grumpy Leonardo, who, while still in Florence, actually wrote kind of a heartbreaking line in which he said, you know, today I find myself completely friendless. And there are all sorts of, again, admissions to himself, because these are not pronouncements or observations or thoughts that were meant to be published. These notes probably come closest to what we would call a journal or a diary, rather than a kind of ricordanze of his work, in which, again, he exhibits so much frustration about these learned, I guess, members of the academy and these mandarins in the court of Ludovico Sforza, who only know book learning, who know nothing of observed, lived experience, and yet they flaunt their Latin, their Greek and Latin, over me because I don't know how to read these texts. And this goes also, again, for these charges of materialism against humankind itself. This is one of his most fascinating allegorical drawings from about 1506 to 1512, now in Windsor, that shows this torrent of things, everything but smartphones, that basically kind of populate and pollute our lives. And there's an inscription here that reads, "O human misery, how many things you must serve for money." And the sketch that I'm showing you here, I think I only have one or two more images to share with you. The one on the right is really the one sketch that I think can be argued to be a faithful representation of Leonardo during his own life. And I say this because it's convincingly attributed to Francesco Melzi, his disciple who was present with him during his last hours. It is probably on this sketch that the woodcut illustrating the beginning of Vasari's life of Leonardo, from which that particular image is taken. And here we must remember once again that there weren't descriptions of his beard, but there were very evocative descriptions of his hair. And so in the so-called Anonimo Gadiano's appendix to the brief biography of Leonardo, he gives at least a little bit of detail, but it's very evocative detail about his appearance, and particularly his beautiful head of hair down to the middle of his breast in ringlets and well arranged. So that's the one written description that we have from his own time. And then we little by little, each representation, the later we get, departs farther and farther from observed truth. The final drawing I want to show you is a recent discovery that some of you may have actually just read about in the last few months in The Guardian or the New York Times. This is a newly identified drawing, and I hope it's a bit faint, but it's been identified by, I think quite convincingly, by Martin Clayton as a representation of Leonardo in old age. He might be actually as old as 65 or so, and some of this is his writing and also studies of equine anatomy. And again, you see these the beard and the beautiful head of hair beneath his hat. And so without further ado, I think I've gone on for too long. Since we still to this day don't quite know what Leonardo looks like, I think we're about to learn what he may have looked like. So, Vittoria. So let me just go all the way down.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I've learned so much from this talk. From beers to drawings to anything in between. Thank you very much, and also because you kept him alive as he would have liked to be. Before we move on to the second part of the evening, that of course centers around Vittoria Chierici, let me pitch very briefly the exhibit that we have upstairs. How many of you have had a chance to see it before coming down? Only 2 people. Then I have to do a pitch. These are drawings by Carlo Levi. How many of you have heard of Carlo Levi? Not Primo Levi. This is Carlo Levi, is the author of Christ Stopped at Eboli. It's a memoir that this trained physician sent into internal confinement by the fascist regime in 1935-36, and encounters a reality that is completely unknown to him, the reality of rural southern Italy. And in Christ Stopped at Eboli, he recounts his experience in contact with the poor peasants of southern Italy for whom Christ never arrived. Their traditions, their way of living predates Christianity. And I was listening to Dennis talking about Leonardo considering himself a painter and then a writer, and very much the same thing happened to Carlo Levi. He was a physician. He didn't want to practice medicine. He had the luxury of not having to because he came from a wealthy family. He wanted to be a painter, an artist. And he found himself in the condition of becoming a writer because of the situation in which he found himself. Long story short, in the last few years of his life, unfortunately, he had diabetes, he had retina detachment, he underwent a couple of surgeries. During these months, when he was almost blind and immobile in bed, in a clinic in Rome, he wanted to continue drawing and writing. And he found a way to have little devices built for him, sort of little wooden frames with little ropes that would help him understand the space even if he could not see clearly. And the drawings that are upstairs are 42 drawings out of a corpus of a total of 145 that he produced at that time. Next to the drawings here, there are the notations of one of his friends and curator that basically says what they are, what the maestro had in mind while he was doing them. So it's a unique opportunity. These pieces have never been seen outside of Italy. They are the work of a great Italian, of a great anti-fascist, of an artist and a writer. And now we're going to go back to Leonardo da Vinci, so back 500 years, but at the same time in contemporary time. And as we said, we have the second part of the evening revolves around Vittoria Chierici's work, and we decided to ask her gallerist here in New York, Filippo Fossati, to come and present her. Filippo was born in a family that was breathing and living with art, so his training comes from a very early age. He's also the founder and of the Esso Gallery here in New York City, along with Jennifer Bacon. And he's an art critic. He writes about art. And I think one of the most important things is that he mentors artists in a way in which gallerists like him still do, but there are not that many left. So I think he deserves credit also for that. And for this, I would like to ask you to welcome Filippo Fossati.
Buonasera a tutti. So I will give you a brief and quick presentation of Vittoria's work, and then Vittoria will go on and explain the project. And I quickly put together, I was asked a few days ago, so I quickly put together a series of images on Vittoria. So we jump 500 years from Leonardo to Vittoria. I don't have any biographical information like on Leonardo. Vittoria comes from Bologna, and she studied there. She studied in Milan and in Bologna, but the university she studied in Bologna, and she's actually an art historian that then turned into an artist. So it's the other way around from Professor Dennis. And she studies in Bologna in the 80s, which is you know, the context of the city is pretty important, and it's a time of great revolutions. And Bologna is a very vital city. Vittoria studies in the university called DAMS, which is the university at the time of art and entertainment, and what was art, entertainment, and something else, and performance. And so it's a very lively and vital context in which there is a lot of music going on, there is theater, there is comics, Pazienza and all the group of Il Male, etc. And there are new artists who are experimenting different things. Vittoria studied art history, and then she comes to the United States, and she goes to Berkeley, if I say something wrong, correct me. And then at Columbia to study photography and then cinema. So then she starts painting from the experience of in a moment in Italy in which there is a certain crisis in painting. So there are a lot of experiments in new media and so on. So this is an early work of Vittoria that was shown in at the Riverside Studio in Tokyo, in London. This one. This is in London. And it's, as you see, how do I go like this? This is the actual work, and it's, as you can see, it looks at the pop work of Warhol. And the room in which you exhibit this work was filled with these, right? There were many, I don't know how many, but what she's looking at is this passage in between the traditional way of painting, because Vittoria comes from tradition, Italian tradition of painting, and then I'm going to show you very briefly what I mean, and always complain about the fact that painting is dead. In a period, you start in a period in reality where painting is very much alive. I mean, there is the trans-avant-garde paintings working and so on. And so this is a little bit of a reaction at the time to the cause. I want to say within the context of Italian art of that time, which is different from the Renaissance, that it's very difficult in Italy to be an artist. I would say that it's very difficult in Italy to be an Italian artist, because Italy loves foreign artists and doesn't really care or give enough value to the Italian artist. Things are changing now, so there are foundations that take care of Italian art. But at the time, this wasn't true. So, I mean, one of the reasons why I think you came abroad was because you didn't have an audience there. This is just to give an idea, very briefly, of the context in which Vittoria was starting her work. I'm just looking fast to your biography because I wrote down some things that I didn't know, and I think that that's it. I don't have pictures of your house or anything like that, but
you have me if you want.
I have you, which I'm going to use. So I'm going to show you a couple of
Without beards.
without beards.
Now. We don't know.
some works that are within the history or the tradition of what Italian art. They are random and they are not in a graphical order. So this is Tano Festa. He's an artist that is considered a pop artist, an Italian pop artist. It's a work from the 60s. And Tano Festa also was trained in photography. His brother Francesco Lo Savio, was an artist who did completely different work from him, like minimalist work, but dealing also with light. So my opinion is that the subject of a painting is always a pretext to say something else, to talk about the artist's work, or to say, or to think about something else, or to. And so what Tano Festa did with this work was, there was an exhibition in Rome of photography of details of Michelangelo's works. And Tano Festa took directly from the photograph the details, so they're not from the actual work, but they are is a painting made from a photograph. And as you see, there are some architectonical elements, so the object is completely taken off its context and put in a different way. It's all blue and so on. This is one of the artists that I see in the tradition of Vittoria's painting. This is another artist called Carla Cardi, who works at the same time of Tano Festa in Rome. She's a Sicilian artist. She had a lot of problems becoming an artist, so she had to tell her family that when she left Sicily, she was going to Milan to be an architect, because an architect is something practical. They build houses and so on. And so she went to Rome and she started making this work that were based in the beginning of theories of colors and forms, and is relevant to the work of Vittoria. We go back in time here. This is a painter from Torino called Felice Casorati. Sorry, Francesco was the son. And again, the subject of this painting, which is eggs and a series of decoration in the back, is a pretext to talk about something different, about what the work, what the artist is trying to make with his paintings, what he wants to and I think that Vittoria has, this is Fontana, and it's a series of the Venices of Fontana. You may know Fontana, probably, I think so. So this is Vittoria very early on, the one on the...
What is that, art?
Show how you now. With a group of artists, Corrado Levi, Kaufman, and this is Alberto Garutti, I believe. So there's a group of artists from Bologna. And also to point out that there were not many women working in the arts, and not many women who had success, not that kept going on. Also for an object difficulty in the art, well, there was not many opening. And this is early work of Vittoria. This is called Galla Placidia, if I'm not wrong. And you can tell us how it's made, no? Acrylics, but what are they? They're the...
You want me to come here?
Yes, come here, please. You're here.
So now I have my cap and my glasses because I recognize the people from Eastport, Maine, and where I actually did all the project that is over there in my suitcase. But then
we'll
I will
get
take
there
it out.
later.
I will take everything off.
So these
But
are like tennis balls.
These are, it's a grid from the mausoleum of
Galla
Galla
Placidia and Ravenna, yeah.
which is in Ravenna if you pass by, and it's one of my first historical subjects
Right.
after Andy Warhol, Coca-Cola.
So this comes
Okay,
right
go.
after and this is another one of the same series of Galla Placidia. And how this relates to the actual Galla Placidia mausoleum in Ravenna?
Because I'm working on multiple I thank you very much for joining me to my crazy world. And one of my crazy things is that I work on multiple projects, so I can reinterpret one subject. So this has been done here in New York in 2010. And the other one in 1992.
Yeah.
So just work on a different, the same subject, but with different feelings.
So yes, we get to talk about the process,
Right,
your
right
process
here.
of working.
Okay,
Let's go. This is another work from the same time, but I need your help because I don't remember dates or anything like that. This is early 90s, no? Or late 80s, early 90s. And this relates also to the battles of Anghiari that you will do later in a certain way. Is a battle but made with toy soldiers. I'm going to finish showing you. This is one of the painting of the series of the Battle of Anghiari. So Vittoria, the process of Vittoria's work is very peculiar for the art world today because it takes time. Vittoria researches a lot, and in this case of Leonardo, she created a series of possibilities. You know the story of the fresco of Leonardo that was supposed to be in the Salone di Cinquecento in front of a Michelangelo fresco, and for reasons that we know, you don't know, the art historian knows, probably he was trying to do something with crude oil that came down. There is nothing. We don't have anything. We know about the fresco through other artists who saw it and depicted. This is the central figure, which is the battle for the standard, is right? And Vittoria went around the world to find all drawings related to the fresco. So you can see some up here. There is a man that appeared in the drawing. It's in Winslow, in Venice, where it is. And there is a series of other things that she put together in various possibilities. So she's thinking of how Leonardo would have made the fresco. This is another Italian artist. I put them all together. This is an artist called Chetti La Rocca who uses images and turns them into text. I was trying to put together a group of images of artists that work for photography or different media. I think in Vittoria's mind, there is painting is always at risk, and is at risk of you say fossilizing. You say that petrifying, or if it's not fossilizing, you say. It's you know. So I think that this is the reason why you are, and I'm really just thinking out loud about your work. Why you do a certain, why you work in a certain way. So Vittoria doesn't really have a studio. She works around the world. She did series of work on this is Vittoria younger in a show with the Battle of Anghiari. This is a series of work made between photography and drawing of a dance company. This is a series of works that she made on a boat going to, where were you going? Okay. And sì, è meglio. So I wrote some notes on the subway, thinking of. This was really fast. I came back from vacation 3 days ago. So what my idea about your work is that because you'll be complaining a lot about the death of paintings and the fact that you cannot succeed with your painting for reasons that are not depending on you. So I thought some thoughts is that is that you think that painting is a risk, you know, of stopping itself in a way, and not because of conventional painters, I don't know how to say, or conformist painters, but because of the viewers, of the conformist viewer, of the conventional viewer. So I think that what you're trying to do is what Baudelaire tried to say with the lecteur hypocrite, is that you want to defend in some way the freedom of and the liberty and independence of painting from this autarky or despotism or tyranny of the I say spineless viewer in a way, because it's the viewer that accepts any kind of pretty image that comes to him, and that's not what you want to do. So the process of you going back to your roots of your art historian, making these huge researches on work, trying to figure out the possibilities, is the pretext for the image that you are going to, at a certain moment, make. And this life, this vitality of painting depends on you transforming the viewer of you being independent from the viewers, how do you say, from the spineless viewer, from the idea of the viewer who's not educated in a way, I don't even know if that's a good word, or that can accept a certain, sorry, this is not yours. I'm trying to figure out where, but this is very much part of the process of Vittoria. What I'm doing here is kind of part of that process.
Yeah,
so I'm working on it. Eh?
You're really telling
What?
to the people, I thank you because you are working on my process.
I'm trying to. I try to.
I will explain in a bit what my process is, yes. It's not easy to
So I'll close it so that we can start saying about...
No, I thank you very much.
So what I think about your painting and what I think they are is that they are instruments for you to be free, to be independent, that you build, and that allows allows us, in reality, all of us, a temporary diversion from these constraints of kind of a rational life. So you get out from this idea of a rational and reasonable life in a way, and in a way that you know, I think that you're right. I mean, there is a painting that is painting is dead in a way when it's not when it's forced by the spectator to be something reasonable, as I say, rational, pretty, and etc. I think that this is the reason why the role that you have in the process, that your process, that is very important. I think is really of Herculean importance because it's a way to drag away from the usual realm and from the usual way of seeing a painting, and these spineless, appalling viewers that only wants the materialization of a pretty pictures in some ways. That's not what you do, and I think that this is the importance of the process of your work. Yeah. I'm just going to finish showing you the images that I put together. I wanted to make a comparison, which is not clear here, but with some artists. This is Mario Schifano, who's another artist from the period of Tano Festa and Carla Cardi from Rome, who used photography and painting together. This is a series of works made in the 70s and based on images he shot on TV. So his process was to turn on, he had TVs on all day, to take pictures and then transforming the images once printed on canvas by painting on it. And this is Vittoria working on another historical project, which was the Raffaello's School of Athens, which was a project, I guess, right before this one, that we showed in Torino and here in New York, and which is again, Vittoria sees the stage of this fresco as a theater in which all these figures that were painted by Raphael to show the knowledge of humanistic and scientific studies at the time. And she think of it as a theater, so it's people talking to each other or groups, and she made all these possibilities. I'm making it. If there is something that's not right, tell me. So she made a series of possibilities, like for Leonardo, but with a different aim. You know, so she works with a projector and then goes in and kind of makes a lecture to herself about the work, and then paints and talks. So her idea at a certain moment was also to make sculptures, so to come out with symbols, your own symbols, from the painting, which were colors or technique. There is also photography in your work, which Raphael didn't obviously had. And this is one of the results of the School of Athens, reread by Vittoria. I think I said everything I could right now with my knowledge, and I thank you very much, and good night. And Vittoria.
Thank you very much.
Grazie.
I really appreciate, because it's the first time I really hear about my work something interesting and intellectually interesting, not just Okay, so I have a little bit of a change of the set. I thank you so much, Dennis, because it gave you the idea, a deep idea, profound idea of those years in which Leonardo was pretty much a young man. We are talking about the end of 1473 up to 1503, right? 1506. And before the beard. And I thank you, Filippo, because he did a wonderful presentation of my process, which is quite a multiple project process, nomadic. I don't have a house. I live in hotels. I work where I find myself well. I thank some of the people I met at Eastport, Maine, because this work has been done in Eastport, Maine, which is a wonderful, wonderful town with wonderful people, the most eastern town in the United States near the Canadian border of New Brunswick. So thank you so much for being here. There's another point I would like to talk about, the fact that because we are talking about Leonardo, which is a huge and monstrous issue, a monstrous subject, it's correct to go and to work on different kind of subjects before get into it. Because as Leonardo said and wrote, thank you for telling me about the writing things, very important, the notebooks of Leonardo, I read many times. It's very important that the brain doesn't really go to the target, but it goes around. So tonight we heard Dennis as an historian, Filippo Fossati as an art writer, let's say, besides being an art dealer. And finally, I want to tell you why I did this project, which is called, has been called many different ways. You can see this is a film which is a loop, and I won't really describe you the single images, so you just keep it, because you already seen these images. This is the Windsor profile, which has been my model in a way. And then eventually you'll see all my attempts, which might be interesting. But I don't want to show you exactly the image. You just look at, as I said, why Leonardo, we still like him, because he is, actually he understood one very important thing, that it was not very modern at that time, and it wasn't that the brain works by itself. So while you're observing nature, you go into meticulous, as you said, the phenomenology of nature, you are a great painter at the same time. Why? Because as Leonardo wrote, do not work every day. Just let your brain work. And it's very important, they call it complete mind, that goes from science to art, from art to science. And it's very, very much more understood nowadays than back then. So what is about all this? I have, you go on, you see it, you watch, you look at these images. All these images, you see, the Windsor profile has been my model, but then I worked on other two hints from history. One is we saw Andrea del Verrocchio, the bronze David, that I saw actually exhibited at the Museum of Bargello in Florence a few months ago. And the other is a fresco, which is one of these images here, where rumors, we don't have documents. Actually, historians base everything, has to base everything on documentation, but artists can work on intuition. So the other is, I took two features. The feature of the Andrea del Verrocchio on one side, the other side was the Bramante, the architect Donato Bramante, who actually depicted probably, it's a presumption, the Leonardo mask, caricature in his fresco at in Milano for Visconti, for one of the Visconti. So anyway, all this process that has been doing for a year, starting in this small town by the Atlantic Ocean, is here in this suitcase, which is called the Pelican Air Case, which is typical for photographers and or filmmakers. And inside here, you can see all these objects that you see on the screen, which means this, like this hat. I have T-shirts, see, but this is a friend of mine who actually posed at the art fair in Bologna, and this is me in Turin, and I have a lot of prints also that I've done. This is a gum print. This is a gum print. This is a print that is made in Parma, where I've been with an old photographer that still prints like in the Victorian age. It's called gum print, but it's similar to sort of between silkscreen and photography. And of course, I have also tried to do real photographs of this file because they all work. These are silkscreen. See, I really worked about this subject in many medium, in many technique, let's say, not medium. The main media, although it's a file, a Photoshop file, a simple work that I've done at the computer. How? Well, I really did a collage of features, thinking of Leonardo as a model, a young model, 25 years old, because we don't know when Verrocchio started actually to conceive and draw the bronze. And we also have the fresco by the caricature by Bramante, which when they say, historians say that he must have been at 38 years old. So I had features of a person of 21 years old and another one, 38. And I did a collage, and it came out pretty good because I have to thank a real scholar that Dennis knows very well, because you studied with him, right? But Professor Martin Kemp from the Oxford University, he is the one who triggered this research of mine, because a year ago I was actually in Oxford and chatting with Martin Kemp, who is probably the major scholar right now among the old ones, Leonardo Da Vinci. We were joking, we were really joking. I said, well, I don't know who is really who was like, I mean, Leonardo da Vinci without that beard and long hair. We were actually talking about a movie who was supposed to come out this year. They didn't do it, not yet. And we were thinking about who was the actor that was very similar to what we think about Leonardo. Actors don't have to look like the character because they have to act like, they have to be like. But in painting portraits, it's a really very important branch, it's a specialization. So I really thought about working on Leonardo as a young man, because I thought about portraits, about how in painting we conceive portrait before photography, and also after photography, because photography in Victorian age is very much a still life posing of people. But photography nowadays, where we conceive photography now, is a snapshot. So what's really it's a big issue, it's a big subject. And this is just my, let's say, approach to it. And it's the result are many many doubts. One of these was who is there any this is the Bramante fresco what I was talking about, and this also they say it was Leonardo was a very good friend of Donato Bramante, was modeling for him. They were friends, and they did together a lot of pageants for Ludovico il Moro in Milano. So as I say, this is my excursus. What you see here is all the things I've been studying, and all my tries, all my tests I've done. And the flyers you have also have some silk screens that I did in some here in New York in a laboratory of the EFA, and this is Verrocchio. These are conceived portraits, something that has to be with the look of Leonardo, but it's not. Because what is really interesting about Leonardo da Vinci, you have nothing really certain. It's the uncertainty of dating a drawing. This is, for example, has been dated by Martin Clayton, 15, which is very late for being that kind of feature. So anyway, and here you can see all my tests. As I say, put together some features that came from some historical hints, but of course I needed also my sort of imagination. Why? Because a profile was an official portrait at that time, still at that time, it came from medallions and from all the tradition of official portraits. It can be really turned into a frontal view because you don't have the measurement between the eyes, between the cheekbones, and between other measurements that you need to reconstruct a sort the frontal view of a profile. Actually, I also asked to people who do three-dimensional portraits, and they told me, well, it's very, very hard to do it. Besides, the paradox is that I wanted to feature Leonardo as a young man, starting from an old man. So there were really a lot of meanings. A paradox, a pretext, as Filippo Fossati said before. It's everything can be true, can be not untrue, it can be interpreted in a different way, and you can really find any kind of historical hints if you want. But at the same time, I am a living artist. I don't know if I'm a contemporary artist, but I'm a living artist. So for me, history, it's like sort of pop art in a way. I mean, it's like because I'm Italian and I lived in history every day, every morning. And you can't really avoid history, can't you? Italy is full of history. I mean, it's not even history. It's just our daily life to walk under a medieval arcade like in Bologna. Or do we make a difference? I couldn't make a difference, at least on an architecture and artistic ground. I can't make a difference between the past, tradition or not tradition. It was over there. I just lived in there. So I try not to think about being a traditional artist or dealing with tradition. I just deal with what I like. I deal what I feel. I deal what I can discover, that I can explore, that I can, find anywhere I go. So that's the reason also why I don't have a really stable studio, because wherever I go, I find something new. Something that is over there, is already there. I don't have to invent anything. Everything has already been invented. And I just have to discover. So the title of this this work is SiamoTuttiLeonardo, we are all Leonardo, because finally I also find gadgets, and I find a mask. The mask was one of the first portrait that I did for Martin Kemp. He liked it, and he said, well, go on, and I went on, because otherwise I wouldn't. This is the funny thing. This is a very poor, simple mask that I go around with us and taking pictures of any people, of the people who has the mask on, and it's really funny because identity goes away. So everybody is like whatever the mask they have on them. So I would like at this point to, because this is a so complicated matter, to have a do you think is a truth what I've done? Or obviously not. We don't want to look for the truth. We want to look for something that inspire, that it gives you more opinions, that it gives you more, something. This is a new character that was born in my mind, and I can work with this character. For example, I will have other meetings with other people because of this character, So it's a medium in itself. So I would like to invite people to ask me questions, because it could be more interesting to understand what you feel, and maybe I have more opportunities to explain something that is really wide. So if anybody have some question about this, what you see, just what you see. Know what you know, because as I say, Leonardo is a really huge subject, right? So we can't really go in a few hours into it. It will take days just to introduce. So, but yes.
Is it possible with the mask, you're inviting people to put themselves, imagine themselves as Leonardo? Is that what you're doing?
Well, not to say really imagining, but I can. It's a game. Everything. I mean, this is a game. This is something that will be put together in a film, in a lapse time film, like the film you saw here. And yeah, it's something that you can imagine that, but just for fun, because I need something for fun, right? This is such a serious matter. You can't really be Leonardo da Vinci, but you can be part of this game. You can be part of a game. Yes?
Hi, I don't know how many people here are hairdressers or anything like that, but I noticed in the David statue, he has great curly hair, and then
Yep.
some of these other people have curly hair, and you've sort of produced short hair on Leonardo's mask. And as the old man, he has sort of wavy hair. I'm just wondering if there's any connection, because it does seem that maybe the hair is some sort of important.
Now, the bird, and see, this is a short hair, and he was 38 years old in this fresco. If he's him, we presume. But the bird actually was fashionable in since 1500, not before that. So, but there is a quotation, a description. And something that I really didn't say is that one of the most important about Leonardo is the description they give him. They wrote about him by Anonimo Gaddiano, Anonimo Bagliamecchiano, and some other, like chronisti. How do you say in English? Chronisti of the Chronicles. It's interesting the description they make, and they say all of them. Also, Vasari said that he was a very handsome man, and the bird and the long hair as probably started when he was after the, let's say, the 1489, the 1499, when he went to Venice, I assume, because of the French were taking over Milano. So because of the war with the French, with the so-called wars of Italy, this is another part of the history of this this project. Many, like Bramante, went to Rome, and he went to Venice with Luca Pacioli, was a mathematician. So I went through the biography of Leonardo da Vinci. I can tell you the bird and the long hair were not when he didn't have when it was depicted by Bramante. That was curly, yes, and he liked it because he wrote in one of his notes, his notebooks, that he really liked long hair and long beard. But he was he was in Milano that time, and he was sketching people that he met in the city, in the town, Milano. Around. He used to go around the town, walk around and sketch with in his notebooks. Okay, so.
Don't cheat.
Okay.
Because I know a bit about this, but I think it will be interesting for everyone else here to hear about your collaborations in the field of forensics with a certain
Okay, yes.
New Jersey.
Well, some years ago, I took some classes of anatomy and forensic anatomy at the Oxford University in UK, and just some classes, nothing special. But I knew the process. I learned the process of investigating looking for a face or reconstructing a face, especially from a bone, from something. It's just the process. I just met years ago a forensic, well, he was not really a forensic artist, but yes, we can say forensic artist from the police of New Jersey. He helped me, because it's very interesting when you work on a missing person. Because in this case, the young Leonardo was like a missing person. Actually, even the old Leonardo, because we don't know. Now we know that probably the drawing at the Royal Library in Turin is not his portrait, or maybe his uncle Francesco. And we don't even know the right, probably, who drew the profile, Windsor profile. There are some doubts about the attribution to Francesco Melzi. So all this uncertainty made me free to go on, because I didn't have really to be tied up to something. And the forensic artist did a sculpture eventually, and he told me, well, it's very hard. We had profiles, but I need to turn the profiles to a frontal face, and he actually told me that he could do, because he did it for a Russian boss of the Russian mafia. He did the same process. So I said, well, why not? So the missing person in this case is Leonardo as a young man, and he did the sculpture, and it was quite useful. I know that someone is working on the profile, a Windsor profile, that I have, by the way, the opportunity to see it personally, and they are trying to turn it into a 3D frontal view. Yes.
On the subject of attribution,
Yeah.
I would like to ask your opinion, and also the other Italian scholars in the front row, of the Salvatore Mundi, a very controversial subject.
Well, because this Martin Kempf is one of the one who actually signed the Salvatore Mundi. I can't really tell you. It's not. I'm not a scholar of Leonardo, and I'm not even obsessed by Leonardo. Actually, I did the Battle of Anghiari years ago, but because it's a mystery, because it's something that you have to search for it. You have to discover, as I say. But Salvator Mundi, I honestly took the eyes of the Salvator Mundi, and I used his eyes or her eyes, maybe, because it's. I don't have my personal opinion, which is absolutely not of a scholar, is that it's more than a woman than a man. And this is because of the collarbone. It has a different kind of aspect of the female and the male, the collarbone. As I said, I did some anatomy classes. I took at Oxford Fine Arts Academy, which is called the Raskin School of Art. And for me, Salvator Mundi is a sort of weird figure in a way, but the eyes are interesting. And so I can't really tell you that to push the eyes, I took the eyes of the Salvator Mundi, I put in my Leonardo as a young man. The eyes, his eyes, are from that panel, isn't it? It's a panel. I actually saw that when he was not restored.
We have time for one more question, if we have it. No. Then I would like to thank Professor Dennis Geronimus and Vittoria Chierici for this great evening. I think this is exactly what we should be doing here, bringing together scholarship and creative artistry. And it was fascinating, the historical reconstruction based on documents and on images that Professor Geronimus gave us, very philologically accurate and lively at the same time. And I found fascinating taking the journey with Vittoria of her discovery that combines art history elements, but also all these other influences, her own creativity, her own method, and even forensic artists and photography and different mediums. So I'm delighted that you joined us and you were here until the end of this evening. Thank you again very much. We have plenty of events coming, but take a look at the drawings of Carlo Levi before going out. Thank you again.